Welcome back to Mr. Giant Reacts to Ting and Ting and Ting. I'm Mr. Giant and I'm back with some more vibes for all, you know what I mean? And this one is called What is Gnosticism? I do believe that's what it says, you know what I mean? This was suggested to me, so I'm going to go ahead and check this out. And I'm going to do this in two parts because it's like 40 minutes long. So I'm going to do it in two parts, all right? Let's YouTube and simmer and see what this here is all about.
Ever since the discovery of the Nag Hammadi library in Egypt in 1945 and the subsequent publication of various non-canonical gospels and other lost ancient texts, there has been an increased interest in the early history and development of Christianity. In particular, there is a growing fascination with the so-called Gnostics and their alternative interpretation of biblical scriptures. But since the study of what is often termed Gnosticism is still very young, there have emerged many different perspectives and interpretations on how this group or groups should be categorized, which texts belong to who, and how they should be understood. As a result, there are often many misconceptions about this topic and its complexities. There's a tendency to sensationalize and exotify these things in ways that don't necessarily align with actual scholarship. So with this in mind, let's take a moment to look at what the latest scholarship says on this topic and ask ourselves the questions: who were the Gnostics and what is Gnosticism?
No, there seem to be so many different branches. I don't want to say sets, but branches in this whole Christianity thing. As a matter of fact, in the whole religion thing, you know, where did this come from? You know, who is pushing what? You know what I mean? It seems like it's been narrowed down to what we know today. And of course, there's two main ones, as we could tell, you know, in society right now. But let's talk about Christianity. There seems to be one main understanding of it. But we have to remember that not too long ago, there was two different sections fighting in Europe, you know what I mean? And I do believe the Protestants, and then of course there's the Catholics and the others, you know, so one branched off of the other. And if you notice, the one that became the leading superpower sort of dictated what Christianity is, to a certain degree, you know what I mean? I mean, Catholicism and stuff like that is still built elsewhere, but you know what I mean? Most people pretty much fall under a sort of Protestant evangelical type of belief, you know what I mean? Because it seems like, that's partly because of missionary, because I remember in my country back in the 80s, I didn't know what a Protestant was. 70s, 80s, I didn't know what a Protestant was until we had our revolution, and then we had the invasion, and then we see a really big influx of Protestants coming to the island after that. You know what I mean? So, yeah, no, I remember when I was a kid, when it was in the 70s, when we first started hearing about them, there was this story about the seven-headed beast. You know, and I didn't know what it was. And, you know, that's pretty much a part of Protestants, or Protestantism, for lack of a better term. And I remember people saying that a fisherman came back in from the ocean and said he saw the seven-headed beast out on the ocean, scaring the crap out of us because I got scared because I didn't understand the concept of all of that preachings of Protestantism. I was raised Catholic. You know what I mean? So that was pretty new to me. I'm saying that to say that the missionaries going out and telling people about Protestants, they spread it. And of course they came from what is professed to be the most powerful superpower at the time. So, you know, it sort of evolved into what we know today. But as we could tell here, there's different parts of it, and nobody talks about that part, the different parts of it, because they want to upkeep what they want people to believe now. And I'm not saying that's right or wrong, I'm just talking here, you know what I mean? Don't jump down my throat and thing. I'm just, from a historical perspective, Because I mean, Catholicism did the same thing when you really think about it. Because once they started to go, they came to the New World, bam, they spread Catholicism in South America, on the islands and stuff like that. And then I don't know how it happened in Africa. I don't see a whole lot of Catholic Africans, as far as I could tell. But anyway, let's keep watching this to check this out.
The term Gnostic can be and is used in a variety of different ways. The word itself comes from the Greek term gnosis, meaning knowledge, or more often a specific kind of knowledge or insight beyond the conceptual. Gnosis is frequently used to mean a kind of intuitive, spiritual knowledge as opposed to everyday information. As such, the word gnosis and Gnostic had positive connotations in many circles in antiquity. The Hermetists, for example, talk about gnosis as opposed to episteme, and proto-Orthodox Christians like Clement of Alexandria use the word to refer to a superior kind of spiritual or intellectual state. And we often see this broad use of the term today in scholarly literature. Various people across history are called, quote-unquote, Gnostics on the basis that they are connected to a supra-rational kind of knowledge. For example, Islamic mystics or Sufis are often referred to as Gnostics, with Arabic words like irfan and arif being possible equivalents. But
A kind of merge of the two, They call in Islamic people Gnostics too, you know what I mean? Wow, that's interesting.
When we talk about the Gnostics, or even Gnosticism, we are more often using the word in a specific way as referring to a movement in early Christianity, one that has become famous for its world-neglecting attitudes and very complex metaphysical scheme. The Gnostics represented one tendency among a multitude of interpretations after the Jesus event, one that eventually disappeared after the gradual formation of a Christian orthodoxy or official church, and which can differ dramatically from the latter. Talking about the Gnostics and Gnosticism can be very difficult, since they didn't survive beyond a few centuries AD. Accessing sources and information about this topic has been hard. The only sources we had for most of history were those written by the heresiologists, so proto-Christians or later writers like Irenaeus, for example, who wrote very critically about the Gnostics and wanted to sort of deem them as heretics. But in 1945, the monumental discovery of the Nag Hammadi library in Egypt revolutionized our understanding of these groups. The Coptic texts found in the library contain writings by the so-called Gnostics themselves, some of which had been mentioned in the works of the heresiologists previously. And since then, we've been able to get a much more comprehensive and nuanced understanding about the ideas and practices of various early Christian communities and schools of thought. Despite this, however, there is disagreement among scholars on how this Gnosticism should be categorized. Some have opted for a very universalist approach to Gnosticism, which views Gnosticism as such as a sort of wider religious or spiritual intellectual movement in antiquity, into which many different groups belonged. So we talk about specifically Christian groups like the Valentinians or the Marcionites or the Sethians, for example, as all belonging to this wider category of Gnosticism. These scholars will often want to include other non-Christian movements or traditions as Gnosticism as well, like the Mandaeans or the Manichaeans, and sometimes even the Hermetists. Many others will argue that there was no such thing as Gnosticism at all. This is just a modern category that we anachronistically applied to a context that was much more complex than that. But many scholars today, including David Bracke in his book The Gnostics, argue for a kind of middle position with a much more narrow definition of Gnosticism as a particular school of thought within the diversity of early Christianity. In this episode, I will be following this more narrow definition of Gnosticism, talking about the Gnostics as, in particular, an expression of early Christianity, and following scholar David Bracke, I will be identifying these Gnostics, especially or particularly with the group that is often known as the Sethians, while also touching on other related movements like the Valentinians, of course. Okay, so who were the Gnostics then? Well, the first thing to have in mind here is the environment of early Christianity. A common way to present the first few centuries after Jesus' death, including by early Christians like Irenaeus, who is a person who will return a lot in this discussion, is with a single Orthodox church from which a number of different sects or heresies diverged. But this, as you might imagine, is a very anachronistic way of reading history. It only seems that way from the perspective of a much later established orthodoxy looking back at its earliest developments. Now, to tell you more about this topic in particular, I've turned to my colleague and the religious scholar Andrew Henry from the channel Religion for Breakfast. So here's him to tell you more.
The discovery of the Nag Hammadi library was so important for historians, not only because we discovered previously unknown works of literature, but it also gave us a glimpse into the social dynamics of early Christianity. It shed some light on what anti-heresy writers like Irenaeus were trying to accomplish. To illustrate what I mean, let's examine the Bishop of Alexandria, Athanasius. In 367 CE, Athanasius published a letter to the churches in Egypt, instructing them which books they're allowed to read. He is the first Christian author to apply the term canon to the same 27 books that most Christians today use in their New Testament. He wrote,
They're telling people which books to read to get their faith from. Now, this is going to be a silly question. Is it really faith if other people are telling you what faith to have? Or what to have faith about? I mean, if they like leaving out certain books and stuff on there and, you know, but maybe that's what works for it, you know what I'm saying? If they say, just have faith, you know. But isn't it still a manipulation because you're not getting all the evidence that you need to foster your faith? Just something to think about.
in these books alone, the teaching of piety is proclaimed. Let no one add to or subtract from them. He goes on to attack anyone teaching and preaching from books outside of this canon. What's interesting is that the Nag Hammadi codices are roughly contemporaneous with Athanasius. Christians right down the road from him were probably reading and copying these so-called Gnostic books. Now, we might be tempted to read Athanasius' letter as a top-down decree that drove these non-canonical writings into hiding. In fact, some early Christian scholars have argued that. But in a groundbreaking article, the scholar of early Christianity, David Brackey, argued that rather than writing from a position of strength, Athanasius was writing from a precarious position in a Christian landscape full of different competing modes of Christianity. His attempt to stipulate what books you're allowed to read reflects more fundamental conflicts between competing modes of Christian authority, spirituality, and social organization. In other words, we're getting a glimpse into competing varieties of how to be Christian, how to do Christianity, during a time when those questions were not yet definitively answered. On one hand, we have varieties of Christianity exemplified by Athanasius, who wanted a closed canon of books and who organized their authority around elected bishops and parishes, who derived their authority through apostolic succession. And on the other hand, with the Nag Hammadi codices, we see evidence for varieties of Christianity that were disinterested in a closed canon. These were Christians who saw no problem with writing more Gospels, Christians who were interested in mystical and philosophical speculation. And when it comes to authority and social organization, we see Christians like the Valentinians that formed study circles around charismatic intellectual leaders. So, when we read anti-Gnostic polemics, we should remember to situate them in this historical context, a time when these groups were still thriving and competing. To use an analogy from David Brackey, these proto-Orthodox writers had not yet won the horse race. The race was ongoing. We're not so much seeing a battle between a unified orthodoxy versus splinter cells of heresies. We're seeing varieties of Christianities all attempting to define their own social group, defining the in-group versus the out-group. There's perhaps no better example of an anti-Gnostic polemicist trying to do this than the Bishop of Cyprus, Epiphanius. In the late 4th century, he wrote a book called the Panarion, which is basically a series of essays attacking several different groups that he labeled as heretics, including the Gnostics. In one passage, he describes a whole mess of disgusting rituals that the Gnostics supposedly practiced. In particular, Epiphanius describes them engaging in ritualized cannibalism. Now, no historian thinks any Gnostic group actually did this, but his polemic is useful in shedding some light on what these heresiologists were trying to do.
Sounds like spreading propaganda to further what he believes. The way he believes that people should think.
What Epiphanius is doing is inventing lurid, unthinkable stories to try to socially categorize the Gnostics as the ultimate evil. The history of religions is full of examples like this. As the scholar of early Christianity, David Frankfurter, argues, accusing your religious rivals of ritualized sex or cannibalism is an effective social psychological strategy to make your opponents easier to attack, easier to expel or ostracize from your own group. And these groups did overlap. Many today think of Gnosticism as a secretive or subversive antithesis to orthodoxy, but these groups and ideas seem to have been out in the open. The Christian writer Tertullian says that Valentinus was almost elected a bishop of Rome. Irenaeus says that Valentinians were attending church groups in his own social circle. The Nag Hammadi codices themselves suggest that there was a vibrant intellectual culture to copy and disseminate these books and collect them into personal libraries, which was not an inexpensive endeavor. Someone of a reasonably high social standing must have collected them. Because there were so few Christians at the time, people like Athanasius and Epiphanius were probably acutely aware of their differences and fought back hard against them, trying to define their preferred mode of Christianity. This is why scholars today prefer to call all of these groups labeled under Gnosticism as varieties of early Christianity, rather than buying into the binary of orthodoxy versus heresy. Varieties highlights the massive diversity of Christianity at the time, and highlights the fact that no one was guaranteed victory at the time. Back to you, Philip.
Dr. Henry is...
But I mean, isn't that how it is now, though? There's just like a whole bunch of different people who have different ways of going to church and stuff. I don't think so much so that there is that villainizing of other Christian groups per se. But isn't that the same thing? I mean, there's like quite a few different types of Baptists. You know, quite a few different types of other religions, you know what I mean? And they have little nuances that are different from each other. So after all this time, the argument continues pretty much.
He's a scholar of religion who specializes in early Christianity. He runs the YouTube channel Religion for Breakfast, which is one of the best channels on YouTube when it comes to religion. So if you haven't checked that out, then you should definitely go check out his channel and subscribe to it. He has some excellent material on the Gnostics in particular if you are interested in knowing more about that topic. The model of a single true church from which heresies diverged has long been abandoned by scholars, but neither should we see it as a group of fixed quote-unquote schools all competing in a race for authority. There wasn't a unified group of proto-orthodox that remained unchanged and eventually won, but a diverse intermingling of ideas, interpretations, and theological positions. Certainly, certain social groups were formed and clusters of similar interpretations emerged in the early centuries, but all these individuals and schools influenced each other and contributed to the gradual development that resulted in the eventual formation of an Orthodox Church. This great diversity is reflected in the corpus of texts found at Nag Hammadi and otherwise, which appear to come from a multitude of different early Christian movements. You have texts that would eventually become part of the Orthodox canon, like the four Gospels of Mark, Matthew, Luke, and John, etc. But we also find texts that belong to the Gnostic school of thought, like the Secret Book of John and the Gospel of Judas. There are texts like the Gospel of Truth, which seems to come from the Valentinians, and even treatises like the Gospel of Thomas, which appears to come from another Christian movement altogether. In other words, there were many different Christianities at this time,
Wow.
most of whom produced many different texts. The Gnostics seem to have been one of the most influential of these movements, and they are mentioned by many other Christians at this time. Most prominently in our old friend Irenaeus, a bishop of Lyon, who very harshly attacks what he considers to be deviant forms of Christianity. In his famous treatise, Detection and Overthrow of Gnosis, falsely so called, sometimes known simply as Against the Heresies, which was written around the year 180, he calls out the Gnostic heresies, or school of thought, and all those inspired by them, like the Valentinians, as having strayed from true Christianity and created a demonically inspired abomination. He traces all of these false teachings back to a supposed teacher or magician called Simon Magus, or Simon the Magician, and that all their claims to gnosis, or true knowledge, was in fact false. Keep in mind that the word heresy simply means a school of thought at this time, and not necessarily heresy as it is used today. In fact, it is due to people like Irenaeus and their writings that that word came to have the meaning that it has today. That's a very interesting side note. In any case, Irenaeus clearly isn't a fan of the Gnostics, and yet his writings has been one of the main sources that we've had for their teachings and practices for most of history. And when we actually read Irenaeus' reports, it seems to align pretty well with the writings by the Gnostics themselves, which we now have since the discovery at Nag Hammadi, which shows that even though he was a polemical writer who wanted to discard the Gnostics as heretics, and his whole argument was that they were wrong, basically, it seems that what he wrote wasn't entirely untrue, and that we can rely to some degree on what he has to say. So in spite of his polemical nature and the fact that he was so critical, Irenaeus still remains one of our main sources and most trustworthy sources to this day. Irenaeus...
Trustworthy? Wouldn't somebody generally writing something about another culture or write from his own perspective? See, now this is all kind of confusing here, you know what I'm saying? Because most of what we know about the Gnostics, according to what he's saying, is what was written by a man who was pretty critical of the Gnostics. Unless he could be totally impartial and just write what they did, you know, because how could we take what we want to take, but not take the part that says that they were like cannibals and stuff like that? How do we differentiate what they really did as a religious group to what he added to it? I guess we can if we look at it from a historical perspective, and then we sort of match it up with other people. But like he said, there's not a whole lot of writing about the Gnostic except for what this gentleman wrote. Quite interesting.
Irenaeus himself clearly doesn't think that this group has access to gnosis, since this was a positive term for most people at the time. So with this in mind, we can be pretty sure that he isn't the one who gave them this name, and that there was a school of thought which appears to have referred to themselves as the Gnostics. It also appears that other groups like the Valentinians, who are actually the main target of Irenaeus' critique, were not considered as part of this Gnostic school, but were nonetheless, of course, inspired by them. This has led many scholars to argue that this Gnostic school of thought, as such, identified by Irenaeus and others at the time, should be identified specifically with a group that we today often call the Sethians, or the Sethian Gnostics. But who?
So maybe his reaction is to that specific group of people, not to what they were teaching. So that specific group of people, hey, you know, they believe the same thing they believe in, but those people are heretics. So there's probably some sort of hidden agenda behind what he's doing there because of the people, more so than what they were writing. Because let's face it, a lot of the stuff that we believe today came from groups that we seem to not like anymore, or we don't like today, you know what I mean? It's like everybody's terrorizing the Jewish people, but everybody's in a Judeo religion, pretty much, or a religion that stems from that. So that could be the same situation here. I don't know.
Who were these Gnostics or Sethians then? What did they believe in? How did they practice? To get to the bottom of these questions, we can look at two primary kinds of sources. those written by other people, like those by Irenaeus, for example, and sources written by the Gnostics themselves. And luckily, due to the discovery at Nag Hammadi, the latter is actually possible today. Out of all the texts found in this collection, there are a few that can, with some certainty, be attributed to the Gnostic school, more narrowly defined. Most primary and influential of these is the so-called Secret Book of John, sometimes called the Apocrypha of John. But there are others like Zostrianos, the Foreigner, the Reality of the Rulers, and the Book of Zoroaster. The very famous Gospel of Judas, which was actually a later find, not a part of the Nag Hammadi library as such, is also usually considered by scholars to belong to the Gnostics. One of the reasons these texts are grouped together and connected to this specific group is that their cosmic myth is relatively consistent throughout, and it is to this myth that we now turn. The Gnostic myth has become famous for its complexity and the way it turns some basic concepts of mainstream Christianity and Judaism on its head. The world of the divine is vast. It's a vast divine world filled with many eons and their relationship with each other. Even, quote-unquote, before the creation of the material world, which takes place outside of time, so before and after has no meaning here, but still, even before the creation of the material world, this complex pleroma of many divine eons, known together as the entirety, existed in harmony. The Gnostics inherited the conception of God and the divine from antiquity and philosophy as a complex realm rather than a stricter monotheism as it later came to be conceived. In any case, at the very top or center of this divine realm, what encompasses the whole affair is the absolute and ultimate God, which is referred to with many names such as the Platonic One or Monad, or as the Father of the entirety, and as the invisible Spirit. This God is understood in common apophatic ways. It is completely unknowable, it cannot be described or understood in any way, and yet it is the source of everything, and indeed the reality in which everything takes place. Quote, "The One is the invisible Spirit. We should not think of it as a God or like a God, for it is greater than a God, because it has nothing over it and no Lord above it. It does not exist within anything inferior to it, since everything exists within it, for it established itself. It is eternal, since it does not need anything, for it is absolutely complete. It has never lacked anything in order to be completed by it. Rather, it is always absolutely, completely in light. The One is illimitable, since there is nothing before it to limit it, unfathomable, since there is nothing before it to fathom it, immeasurable, since there was nothing before it to measure it, invisible, since nothing has seen it, eternal, since it exists eternally, unutterable, since nothing could comprehend it to utter it, unnameable, since there is nothing before it to give it a name."
Oh, wow.
The invisible Spirit is a kind of intellect. In other words, in some way not understandable to us, it thinks about itself and knows itself. And in the process of this thinking, God is devolved into the complex world of eons, the entirety already described. These eons are kind of like God's thoughts about himself, thus being both identical to him, but simultaneously also somehow different. In the words of David Brackey, quote, "The eons that make up the entirety result from the invisible Spirit's knowledge or thought of itself. They are its thinking or its intellect in all its complexity. They form also a spiritual realm, the equivalent of Plato's realm of ideal forms. For the Gnostics, the entirety that the eons constitute is truly real and eternal. The material world is a flawed imitation of the entirety and destined to perish." Now, all these eons, which are kind of like divine beings or divine lights, are named after certain divine attributes, the faint imitations of which we can find in the material world. The first emanation or eon that appears from the invisible Spirit, sometimes known as the second principle, is called forethought, or by the name of Barbelo. Quote, "His," in other words the invisible Spirit, "thought became a reality, and she who appeared in his presence in shining light came forth. She is the first power who preceded everything and came forth from his mind as the forethought of the all. Her light shines like the Father's light. She, the perfect power, is the image of the perfect and invisible Virgin Spirit. She, the first power, the glory of Barbelo, the perfect glory among the eons, the glory of revelation, she glorified and praised the Virgin Spirit, for because of the Spirit she had come forth. She is the first thought, the image of the Spirit. She became the universal womb, for she precedes everything. The Barbelo serves as the most central of the eons, from which all others then originate. It is also a feature that all Gnostic sources have in common, whereas everything beyond or after the Barbelo can differ between texts and different authors. But this second principle is also very important for its connection to Christianity, because it is central to the idea of Christ. In the secret book of John, the Barbelo, together with the invisible Spirit, begets the self-originate, or Christ, thus forming a kind of family triad: Father, the invisible Spirit; Mother, the Barbelo; and Son, Christ. We will return more to the role of Christ in the Gnostic myth later, but this self-originate, or Christ, also serves as a transitionary aeon between the Barbelo and the rest of the multitude of aeons that make up the entirety, and he is often described as being the ruler over the rest of the aeons. Around it, this Christ aeon are four luminaries referred to as Harmozel, Uriel, Daoethai, and Eleleth, which also contain the archetypal human beings, Adam and his son Seth. From these four luminaries, or eons, stem further eons, and you can see how this system is very complicated and hard to grasp. It is also important to remember that the different Gnostic texts give different accounts on this divine realm and its eons, so it's hard to say anything definitive about the details.
Okay, I'm going to stop this one here. It's just going to end part 1, and I'm going to start part 2 right about here. One interesting thing though, that Barbelo, they said she a lot in there. And, you know, I don't see she coming up much in more in modern vibes, you know what I mean? I don't see that at all. But it's kind of interesting that they use the noun she on the scene there and thing. But anyway, I'm going to stop this one here. Come back for part 2, y'all, because this is quite interesting here, you know, and especially now that they get into the meat of explaining the whole concept of Gnosticism. But y'all take care of each other, all right? Cool runnings. Link in the description.